The crushing weight pressed against Rose's chest like a freight train made of molten steel, each breath a desperate battle against invisible hands squeezing her ribcage. She clutched the kitchen counter, her knuckles white against the marble surface her mother had insisted on during last year's renovation, the same counter where Rose had eaten countless childhood breakfasts, where she'd done homework under warm afternoon light, where she'd cried over her first heartbreak at 16. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Mom," Rose gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the thundering in her ears. The pain radiated down her left arm like lightning following a familiar path, and cold sweat beaded across her forehead despite the warmth of the August morning. "Mom, something's wrong. Really wrong." Margaret Chen looked up from her crossword, puzzle. Her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for 30 years. At 62, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd never allowed herself the luxury of weakness, who'd raised 3 children through 2 divorces and a recession without ever missing a mortgage payment. "Rose, honestly." Margaret's voice carried that familiar edge of exasperation, the same tone she'd used when Rose claimed she was too sick for school, when she'd complained about stomach aches before piano recitals, when she'd sobbed over scraped knees that barely broke the skin. "You're 28 years old. Stop being so dramatic about every little ache and pain." The words hit Rose like physical blows, each syllable a small betrayal. She doubled over, her face contorting as another wave of agony crashed through her chest. The kitchen tilted sideways, the familiar yellow walls with their cheerful sunflower borders swimming in her vision. This was the same kitchen where her mother had bandaged playground injuries with gentle hands, where she'd made chicken soup during Rose's childhood fevers, where she'd held Rose while she cried over failed college exams. "This isn't..." Rose tried to speak, but her throat felt like it was closing. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, a crushing, tearing sensation that made her previous complaints seem laughable in comparison. "This isn't like before, Mom. Please." Margaret's sigh was audible across the room. She set down her pen with deliberate precision, the small sound echoing in the suddenly oppressive silence. "Every week it's something new with you. Last month, it was those headaches that turned out to be nothing. The month before that, you were convinced you had some rare disease because your back hurt after you helped Sarah move. Rose's best friend Sarah Martinez had been urging her to see a doctor for months. Sarah, with her nurse's training and sharp intuition, had noticed things Margaret either couldn't or wouldn't see. The way Rose's face would pale during family dinners, how she'd press her hand to her chest when she thought no one was looking, the subtle shortness of breath that followed her up the stairs to her childhood bedroom where she still lived, despite her mother's increasingly pointed comments about independence. "You need to learn to cope with normal adult stress," Margaret continued, her attention already returning to the crossword. 7 letters for excessive theatrical behavior." She paused, looking pointedly at Rose. "Histrionics. How fitting." Thoughts. Cruelty of the comment pierced through Rose's agony like a shard of glass. She slumped against the counter, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. The same counter where her mother had celebrated Rose's college graduation with a small cake, where they'd planned Rose's father's funeral service 5 years ago, where Margaret had held Rose's hand and promised they'd get through anything together. Rose fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her chest and arm. The device felt impossibly heavy, the numbers on the screen blurring together like watercolors in rain. 9. 1. 1. The most important numbers in the world, and she could barely see them. "What are you doing now?" Margaret's voice carried a note of genuine annoyance. "Really, Rose, this attention-seeking behavior has to stop. You're not a child anymore." "Calling ambulance," Rose managed between gasps, her thumb hovering over the call button. The simple act of speaking felt like running a marathon, her heart hammering against her ribs with an irregular, terrifying rhythm. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You will do no such thing. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it would be for the neighbors to see ambulances in our driveway? Again?" The word "again" hung in the air like an accusation, referencing the time 6 months ago when Rose had convinced herself she was having an allergic reaction to shrimp, only to discover it was anxiety-induced hives. "I'm not going to let you waste emergency resources on another one of your episodes," Margaret continued, moving toward Rose with determined steps. "Give me that phone." But Rose's finger was already pressing the call button, her survival instinct overriding years of conditioning to defer to her mother's judgment. The line connected with a calm professional voice that cut through her panic, like a beacon in a storm. "1. What's your emergency?" I think I'm having a heart attack," Rose whispered, each word a monumental effort. "I'm 28. Chest pain. Can't breathe." "Ma'am, I'm sending an ambulance to your location immediately." The dispatcher's voice was steady, reassuring. "Can you tell me your exact address?" Rose recited the familiar address through gritted teeth. 1247 Maple Street, the house where she'd lived her entire life except for 4 years of college. The house with the red front door her father had painted the summer before he died. The house with the tire swing still hanging from the oak tree in the backyard. The house that had always meant safety until this moment. "Rose, hang up that phone right now." Margaret's voice cut through the kitchen like a whip crack, loud enough that even the dispatcher could hear her clearly. "Ma'am, is someone there with you?" the dispatcher asked, concern evident in their tone. "My mother," Rose gasped. She thinks I'm faking." "Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line with me. The ambulance is approximately 8 minutes away. Is your front door unlocked?" Margaret snatched at the phone, but Rose clutched it against her chest, protecting it like a lifeline. "You're embarrassing our entire family," Margaret hissed. "When those paramedics get here and find nothing wrong with you, again, what do you think they're going to tell people? What do you think Dr. Peterson will say when he hears about this?" Dr. Peterson had been their family physician for 15 years, a kind man who'd known Rose since she was 13. He'd been patient with her various health concerns over the years, always taking time to listen, always running tests when she worried. Margaret had increasingly begun to frame these visits as evidence of Rose's hypochondria rather than a doctor's diligence. The pain in Rose's chest shifted, spreading like spilled acid across her ribs. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, now irregular and frightening, like a drummer who'd lost the rhythm. Her vision began to tunnel, the bright kitchen fading at the edges. Ma'am, are you still with me?" The dispatcher's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Still here," Rose whispered. "Getting worse. The paramedics are almost there. I can see them turning onto your street now. Are you able to unlock the front door?" Rose looked toward the hallway that led to the front entrance, a distance that might as well have been miles. Every step would be agony, and she wasn't sure her legs would carry her that far. But the alternative was lying here on the kitchen floor while her mother berated her and precious minutes ticked away. "I'll try," she managed. "Rose, if you take one step toward that door, I will never forgive you," Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet. "This family has a reputation in this community. Your father and I worked for 30 years to build our good name, and I will not watch you destroy it with these theatrics." The words were designed to stop Rose in her tracks, and for a moment, they did. The weight of her mother's disapproval, accumulated over years of being told she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. But the crushing pain in her chest was becoming unbearable. And somewhere beneath the fog of agony, a small voice, maybe her father's voice, maybe her own, whispered that her life mattered more than her mother's reputation. Rose took a step toward the hallway, then another. Each movement sent fresh waves of nausea through her body, but she kept moving, one hand pressed to her chest, the other clutching her phone like an anchor to the world of people who wanted to help her. "That's it, ma'am. You're doing great," the dispatcher encouraged. "The paramedics are pulling into your driveway now." Through the front window, Rose could see the red and white ambulance, its lights cutting through the morning calm of Maple Street. Neighbors would indeed be watching. Mrs. Patterson from next door was already at her window, and Mr. Kim across the street had paused his lawn mowing to stare. But for the first time in her life, Rose didn't care about their judgment. She cared only about the uniformed figures climbing out of the ambulance, carrying equipment that might save her life. She reached the front door and turned the deadbolt with shaking fingers. The simple action left her breathless, and she had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. Through the glass, she could see the paramedics approaching, a tall, black man carrying a medical bag and a shorter Latina woman wheeling equipment up the walkway. Rose opened the door just as they reached the steps. "Thank God," she breathed. "Ma'am, I'm Luis, and this is Carmen," the male paramedic said, his voice calm and professional. "We're going to take good care of you. Can you tell me what you're experiencing?" "Chest pain," Rose gasped. "Started about 15 minutes ago, sharp, crushing, down my left arm." Carmen was already taking Rose's pulse, her fingers gentle but sure against Rose's wrist. "Your heart rate's elevated and irregular," she noted. "Any family history of heart disease?" "My father?" Rose began, but Margaret's voice cut through from behind her. "Officers, I am so sorry you were called out here for nothing," Margaret said, appearing in the hallway with her practiced smile, the one she wore for church functions and book club meetings. "My daughter has a tendency toward hypochondria. She's been doing this since she was a child, imagining symptoms, working herself into a panic." Luis and Carmen exchanged a quick glance. They'd clearly dealt with similar situations before, but their training and instincts were telling them something different than what Margaret was suggesting. "Ma'am, with respect, we need to let your daughter describe her symptoms," Luis said firmly. "Rose, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your pain?" 9, Rose whispered. "Maybe 10. I've never felt anything like this." Carmen was attaching electrodes to Rose's chest, her movements quick and efficient. "We're going to get an EKG reading," she explained. "This will help us see what your heart's doing." "This is ridiculous," Margaret said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. The presence of the paramedics, their serious expressions and professional equipment, was making her earlier dismissal seem less reasonable. "She's always been dramatic about pain. When she was 7, she cried for an hour over a splinter." "Stop being dramatic!" Margaret's voice suddenly rose to a shout, the same words she'd used countless times over the years. But now they echoed in the hallway where strangers could hear them, where people with medical training were witnessing their toxic family dynamic in real time. The EKG machine began beeping, and Carmen's expression grew serious as she studied the readout. "Luis, we need to transport immediately," she said quietly, but not quietly enough that Rose couldn't hear the urgency in her voice. "What is it?" Rose asked, though part of her already knew. The machine's irregular beeping told its own story. A rhythm gone wrong. A heart in distress. "You're having a heart attack," Luis said gently. "We need to get you to the hospital right now." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Margaret's face went white, her practiced composure finally cracking. For 28 years, she had dismissed Rose's concerns, labeled them as attention-seeking, dramatic, hypochondriacal. And now, paramedics were confirming that Rose's life was in immediate danger. That's not possible," Margaret stammered. "She's only 28. People her age don't have heart attacks." "Anyone can have a heart attack, ma'am," Carmen said as she and Luis prepared the stretcher. "Young women especially are often misdiagnosed because their symptoms are dismissed as anxiety or stress." The weight of those words settled over the hallway like a heavy blanket. Rose looked at her mother, seeing something she'd never seen before in Margaret's eyes: fear. Not just fear for Rose's health, but fear of what her own actions might have caused. The years of dismissal, the constant accusations of drama, the refusal to take Rose's concerns seriously. How many warning signs had been ignored? How many times had Rose's body tried to tell them something was wrong, only to be silenced by accusations of attention-seeking? As Luis and Carmen helped Rose onto the stretcher, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. Pale, sweating, clutching her chest. She looked exactly like someone having a heart attack, and the validation was almost as overwhelming as the pain. She hadn't been imagining it. She hadn't been dramatic. Her body had been trying to save her life, and she'd almost waited too long to listen. The last thing Rose heard as they wheeled her toward the ambulance was her mother's voice, smaller now, uncertain. I'll follow you to the hospital." But Rose wasn't sure she wanted her to. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she could trust her mother to be on her side when it mattered most. The ambulance siren wailed through the streets of Millbrook, each note a soundtrack to Rose's racing thoughts as Carmen monitored her vitals, and Luis radioed ahead to St. Mary's Hospital. Through the small window, Rose caught glimpses of the familiar neighborhoods where she'd grown up. The corner market where she'd bought penny candy as a child, the park where she'd learned to ride a bike, the library where she'd spent countless afternoons hiding in the stacks when home felt too overwhelming. 28 years old and still living at home, the thought had become a constant source of shame, whispered about at high school reunions and family gatherings. But the truth was more complicated than anyone understood, including Rose herself until this moment when her heart was literally breaking down, forcing her to confront the patterns that had shaped her entire life. Rose had been born during one of the worst snowstorms in Millbrook's history, arriving 3 weeks early while her father Jack paced the hospital waiting room, and her mother Margaret timed contractions with the same precision she applied to everything else. "She came into this world making a fuss," Margaret would tell people, as if Rose's early arrival was an intentional act of rebellion rather than a medical necessity. Jack Chen had been different from his wife, softer, more intuitive, quicker to offer comfort than correction. He'd been the one to hold Rose during nightmares, to take her temperature when she claimed to feel sick, to sit with her during homework tears without immediately jumping to solutions. "Listen first, judge never," he'd always said, a philosophy that had driven Margaret crazy with its apparent inefficiency. When Rose was 6, she'd complained of stomach pain every morning before school for 2 weeks. Margaret had diagnosed it as school avoidance and marched Rose to class despite her tears and pleas. It wasn't until Rose collapsed during recess and was rushed to the hospital that they discovered the appendicitis that had gone untreated for far too long. Jack had held Rose's hand during the surgery while Margaret paced the waiting room, muttering about missed work and overreaction, and children who couldn't articulate their symptoms properly. "I'm sorry, Rosebud," Jack had whispered as Rose recovered, using the pet name that made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. "I should have listened better." But Margaret's voice had been louder, more persistent, more consistently present in their daily life. Jack worked long hours as an insurance adjuster, traveling to assess damage from accidents and disasters, while Margaret maintained their household with military precision. She ran the PTA, organized church potlucks, kept meticulous financial records, and expected the same level of competence from everyone around her. "You can't coddle her," Margaret would tell Jack when he suggested taking Rose's complaints more seriously. "She needs to learn the difference between real problems and minor discomfort. The world isn't going to stop every time she has an ache or a pain." Rose learned to read the room, to assess whether her concerns would be met with comfort or criticism. She developed an internal barometer for her mother's mood, a survival skill that served her well, but also taught her to doubt her own perceptions. If her mother seemed stressed about work, Rose kept her complaints to herself. If Margaret was already annoyed about something else, Rose would swallow her problems rather than add to the burden. At 12, Rose had developed what she now recognized as anxiety, though at the time she only knew that her heart raced before tests, that her stomach hurt during social situations, that she often felt like she couldn't catch her breath. She'd tried to tell her parents, but Margaret had dismissed it as preteen drama, while Jack had been traveling more frequently, taking longer assignments that kept him away from home for weeks at a time. Every generation finds new ways to be delicate, Margaret had said during one particularly difficult period when Rose was missing school regularly due to panic attacks she couldn't name or explain. Your grandmother raised 8 children during the Depression and never once complained about her nerves. The comparison to stronger, more resilient ancestors became a constant theme in their household. Rose learned that her struggles were evidence of weakness, that previous generations had faced real hardships while she was crumbling under the weight of normal childhood experiences. She learned to present a competent facade while her internal world churned with unaddressed anxiety and self-doubt. High school had brought some relief in the form of Sarah Martinez, who'd transferred to Millbrook during their sophomore year and immediately recognized something familiar in Rose's carefully controlled exterior. Sarah's own mother was a nurse who took health concerns seriously, who believed in preventive care and emotional wellness in ways that seemed foreign to Rose's experience. "Your mom's kind of intense," Sarah had observed after their first sleepover, where she'd witnessed Margaret's morning routine of scheduled activities and constant productivity expectations. "She just wants me to be strong," Rose had defended, though even then she'd recognized the truth in Sarah's gentle observation. Sarah's house had become Rose's sanctuary, a place where minor injuries were tended without drama, where stomach aches were treated with ginger tea and concern rather than suspicion, where emotions were discussed openly rather than managed through criticism. Rose began to understand that not all families operated like hers, that care could be offered without judgment, that love didn't have to come with conditions of perfect health and emotional stability. College had been Rose's first real taste of independence. 4 years at State University, where she'd studied communications and learned to trust her own perceptions without her mother's constant commentary. She'd made friends, dated briefly, even visited the campus health center when she felt unwell without agonizing over whether her symptoms were real enough to warrant attention. But even at college, Margaret's influence had followed her. Phone calls twice a week, always beginning with health check-ins that felt more like interrogations than expressions of care. Are you getting enough sleep? Eating properly? Not letting stress get to you? The questions came with undertones of expectation. Rose should be healthy, competent, independent. Any struggles were failures to launch properly into adulthood. When Rose had called home with a bout of food poisoning during her junior year, Margaret's first response had been exasperation. "What did you eat? Where did you eat it? Why weren't you more careful?" The illness became Rose's fault, a failure of judgment rather than an unfortunate experience that required care and recovery. Rose had graduated with decent grades and a degree in communications, but the job market had been brutal, and she'd moved back home temporarily while she searched for work. Temporary had become permanent through a series of small compromises and practical considerations. The rent saved by living at home allowed her to pay off student loans faster. Margaret needed help with household management as she took on more responsibility caring for Jack, whose health had begun declining in his late 50s. Jack's heart attack at 59 had been sudden and massive, nothing like the slow, crushing pain Rose was experiencing now in the ambulance. He'd collapsed at work, been rushed to the hospital, and never regained consciousness. Rose had been 23, just finding her footing in her first real job at a local marketing firm, when the call came that changed everything. Margaret had handled the funeral arrangements with characteristic efficiency, coordinating flowers and obituaries and casseroles from church friends, while Rose sat stunned in the same kitchen where she now lay on a stretcher. The grief had been overwhelming, But even more overwhelming had been the loss of her primary ally in the family, the person who'd always been willing to consider that Rose's concerns might be legitimate. Without Jack's tempering influence, Margaret's tendency toward dismissal had become more pronounced. Rose's grief had been excessive and attention-seeking. Her difficulty sleeping after her father's death was wallowing. Her reluctance to date or move out was using trauma as an excuse for failure to launch. The years after Jack's death had created a strange codependency between mother and daughter. Margaret claimed to want Rose to become more independent while simultaneously criticizing every step Rose took toward autonomy. Job interviews were subjected to detailed analysis and judgment. Potential apartments were deemed too expensive, too dangerous, or too far from home. Dating prospects were either unsuitable or evidence that Rose was being too picky and would end up alone. Rose had learned to navigate this impossible maze by staying small, keeping her ambitions modest, her complaints minor, her presence unobtrusive. She'd worked at the same marketing firm for 5 years, never pushing for promotions that might create conflict at home. She'd dated occasionally, but never seriously enough to threaten the household dynamic. She'd developed health concerns over the years, fatigue, chest tightness, difficulty sleeping, but had learned to manage them privately rather than invite Margaret's analysis and judgment. The chest pains had started 6 months ago, sporadic, at first, easily dismissed as stress or poor posture from too many hours at a computer. Rose had mentioned them once to Margaret, who'd immediately diagnosed work stress and suggested better time management. When Rose had brought them up during a routine physical with Dr. Peterson, he'd ordered some basic tests that had come back normal, though he'd noted her elevated blood pressure and suggested monitoring. "See?" Margaret had said when the test results came back clear. "I told you it was stress. You need to learn to manage your emotions better instead of letting every little worry manifest physically." But the episodes had been getting more frequent, more intense. Rose had started keeping a log on her phone. When the pain occurred, how long it lasted, what might have triggered it. She'd researched heart disease in young women, learned about the ways their symptoms were often dismissed or misdiagnosed. She'd wanted to make another appointment with Dr. Peterson, but Margaret's voice had been in her head. "You just went to the doctor. Stop looking for problems that don't exist." Now, lying in the ambulance with electrodes attached to her chest and an oxygen mask covering her face, Rose realized how many warning signs she'd ignored, how many times her body had tried to tell her something was seriously wrong. The crushing guilt was almost as painful as the heart attack itself. She'd been complicit in her own dismissal, trained so thoroughly to doubt her own perceptions that she'd nearly died rather than trust what her body was telling her. "How are you feeling, Rose?" Carmen asked, checking the monitors that were tracking her heart rhythm. "Scared," Rose admitted, the word coming out muffled by the oxygen mask but clear enough for Carmen to understand. "That's completely normal," Carmen said gently. "Heart attacks are terrifying, especially when you're young. But you did the right thing calling for help when you did." Rose thought about how close she'd come to not calling, how her mother's voice had nearly convinced her to endure the pain rather than risk embarrassment. How many other young women had died because they'd been taught to doubt their own bodies, to prioritize other people's comfort over their own survival? The ambulance pulled into St. Mary's emergency bay, and Rose caught a glimpse of the hospital where she'd been born, where her father had died, where she was now fighting for her life. The continuity felt significant, like the completion of some cosmic circle she hadn't known she was tracing. As the paramedics wheeled her toward the emergency room doors, Rose made a promise to herself. If she survived this, if she got through, whatever was happening to her heart, she would never again let anyone convince her to ignore what her body was telling her. She would trust her own perceptions, seek her own medical care, make her own decisions about what was worth worrying about. She would learn to be her own advocate, even if it took 28 years and a near-death experience to figure out how. Saint us. Mary's hospital emergency room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday morning. Families with sick children clustered in uncomfortable chairs, elderly patients wheeled in from nursing homes, and the steady stream of weekend accidents that kept the medical staff moving like synchronized dancers in scrubs. Dr. Patricia Williams had been working the ER for 12 years, long enough to develop an instinct for separating genuine emergencies from anxiety-induced visits, but also long enough to know that young women's cardiac events were missed more often than anyone in the medical community wanted to admit. When the paramedics wheeled in Rose Chen, Dr. Williams took one look at the EKG readout and immediately called for the cardiac team. 28-year-old female, acute ST elevation myocardial infarction, Luis reported as they transferred Rose to the hospital gurney. Symptoms began approximately 30 minutes ago. Patient called 911 herself despite family dismissal of symptoms. Dr. Williams raised an eyebrow at the last detail. She'd seen it before. Family members, often mothers, who'd been conditioned to view women's pain as hysteria, who carried forward generations of medical gaslighting without realizing the deadly consequences. "Rose, I'm Dr. Williams," she said, leaning over the gurney as nurses attached additional monitors and prepared IV lines. "You're having a heart attack, and we need to get you to the cardiac catheterization lab immediately. Do you understand what's happening?" Rose nodded, though understanding felt like a loose term for the surreal experience of hearing her own death sentence delivered in calm, medical language. Her chest still felt like it was being crushed in a vice, but the oxygen mask was helping, and the pain medication they'd given her in the ambulance was taking the sharpest edges off the agony. "Is there someone we should call?" Dr. Williams asked. "Family member? Emergency contact?" "My mother's following the ambulance," Rose managed to say. "And my best friend's Sarah Martinez. She's a nurse at Riverside Community." Dr. Williams made note of this information while the cardiac team assembled around Rose's gurney. Dr. James Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, was the interventional cardiologist on call, a slight man in his 40s whose calm competence had saved hundreds of lives over his career. "Rose, I'm Dr. Chen, and I'm going to fix your heart," he said with the kind of quiet confidence that made Rose believe him despite everything. "What we're seeing on your EKG suggests that one of your coronary arteries is blocked. We're going to take you upstairs and use a catheter to open that blockage. The procedure is called a percutaneous coronary intervention, or PCI." As they wheeled Rose toward the elevator, she caught sight of Margaret rushing through the emergency room doors, looking haggard and frightened in a way Rose had never seen before. Margaret had changed from her casual Saturday morning clothes into a dress and cardigan, as if preparing for church or a social event rather than a medical emergency. Armor against the judgment she was convinced would come from hospital staff who might question her parenting. "Where are you taking her?" Margaret demanded, reaching for Rose's hand as the gurney moved. "Ma'am, your daughter needs immediate cardiac surgery," Dr. Chen explained. "The catheterization lab is on the 4th floor. You can wait in the cardiac surgery waiting room and we'll update you as soon as we know more." "Surgery?" Margaret's voice went up an octave. "But she's only 28. People her age don't need heart surgery. Are you sure this isn't just an anxiety attack?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Rose saw Dr. Chen's expression tighten almost imperceptibly, a professional mask sliding into place over what she suspected might be frustration or disgust. "Ma'am, your daughter is having an acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack," Dr. Chen said with careful patience. "Her cardiac enzymes are elevated, and her EKG shows clear evidence of blocked coronary circulation. This is not anxiety. This is not stress. This is a life-threatening medical emergency that requires immediate intervention." Margaret's face crumpled, and for a moment Rose saw through her mother's defensive facade to the frightened woman underneath. But even frightened, Margaret couldn't seem to stop herself from the patterns of dismissal that had defined their relationship. "But she's always been prone to dramatics," Margaret said, her voice smaller but still insistent. Ever since she was little, she's made mountains out of molehills. Just last week, she was convinced she had food poisoning, and it turned out to be nothing more than eating too fast. Dr. Williams, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped forward. Mrs. Chen, I understand this is frightening and unexpected, but I need you to understand something very clearly. Your daughter is not being dramatic. She is not exaggerating. She is having a massive heart attack, and every minute we spend discussing this instead of treating her increases her risk of permanent heart damage or death. The word death seemed to stop Margaret in her tracks. Rose watched her mother's face cycle through emotions, denial, fear, guilt, and something that might have been dawning comprehension. The cardiac surgery waiting room is on the 4th floor. Elevator bank C, Dr. Williams continued. We'll keep you informed throughout the procedure, but right now we need to focus on saving your daughter's life. As they entered the elevator, Rose reached out and caught her mother's hand. Margaret's fingers were ice-cold and shaking, and Rose realized that beneath all the dismissal and criticism, her mother was terrified of losing her. I love you, Mom, Rose whispered through the oxygen mask. Margaret squeezed her hand, tears finally spilling over. I love you too, baby. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The elevator doors closed, cutting off further conversation. And Rose was wheeled into a world of medical technology and life-saving procedures that felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. These people believed her. These people were taking her seriously. These people were going to try to save her life. Dr. Chen's team moved with practiced efficiency, explaining each step as they prepared Rose for the catheterization. The procedure itself was surreal. Rose remained conscious while tiny cameras threaded through her arteries, sending images to monitors where Dr. Chen could see exactly what was happening inside her heart. There it is, Dr. Chen murmured, pointing to the screen where Rose could see a dark shadow blocking what should have been a clear pathway. Complete occlusion of the left anterior descending artery. That's your widowmaker, Rose. You're very lucky you called for help when you did. The widowmaker. Rose had read about this particular type of heart attack in her research, the one that killed quickly and without warning, the one that took healthy-seeming people in their 30s and 40s and left families devastated and confused. She thought about how close she'd come to letting her mother talk her out of calling 911, how she might have endured the pain for hours rather than seek help. I'm going to place a stent now, Dr. Chen explained. You might feel some pressure, but the local anesthetic should keep you comfortable. Rose watched on the monitor as a tiny balloon inflated inside her artery, crushing the clot against the vessel wall and restoring blood flow to her heart muscle. The relief was almost immediate. The crushing pain that had dominated her consciousness for the past hour began to ease, replaced by a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. Beautiful, Dr. Chen said with satisfaction as blood flow resumed. That should do it. How are you feeling, Rose? Better, Rose said, though better felt like an inadequate term for the complex mix of relief, gratitude, and existential terror that was washing over her. Thank you. Thank you for believing me. Dr. Chen looked at her with something that might have been surprise. Rose, you had every symptom of a classic heart attack. Of course we believed you. But Rose knew it wasn't that simple. She'd read the statistics about women's cardiac events being dismissed as anxiety, about young women dying because emergency room staff assumed they were too young for heart disease, about mothers and wives whose symptoms were attributed to hysteria, or attention-seeking until it was too late. As they wheeled her to recovery, Rose found herself thinking about all the other young women who might be experiencing chest pain right now, who might be talking themselves out of seeking help because someone in their life had convinced them they were being dramatic. She thought about the cultural conditioning that taught women to minimize their pain, to prioritize other people's comfort over their own survival, to doubt their own perceptions when those perceptions conflicted with other people's expectations. Recovery, a different kind of reckoning was beginning. Rose's heart was beating steadily now, the monitor showing a regular rhythm that was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. But the emotional processing was just beginning, and she had a feeling that surviving the heart attack might be easier than surviving the aftermath of everything it had revealed about her life and relationships. Sarah Martinez arrived 40 minutes after the procedure, still in her scrubs from the overnight shift she'd just finished at Riverside Community. She burst into Rose's recovery room like a force of nature, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail and her brown eyes blazing with a mixture of relief and fury. "Jesus Christ, Rose," Sarah breathed, rushing to the bedside and taking Rose's hand, in both of hers. "When your mom called me, I thought I was going to lose you." Rose squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling the first genuine comfort she'd experienced all day. Sarah smelled like hospital disinfectant and the lavender, hand lotion she always carried, familiar scents that meant safety and unconditional support. "I'm okay," Rose whispered. "They put in a stent. Dr. Chen says I should make a full recovery." "The Widowmaker," Sarah said, reading Rose's chart with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many cardiac cases. "Rose, this is serious. LAD. Occlusions. They don't mess around. You could have died." The weight of those words settled between them. Rose had been avoiding thinking about how close she'd come to dying, but Sarah's clinical assessment made it impossible to ignore. If she'd waited even another hour, if she'd let Margaret convince her to ride out the pain, she might not be here to have this conversation. "Where's your mom?" Sarah asked, looking around the recovery room. "Waiting room, I think. She's not handling this well." Sarah's expression darkened. "Is she still insisting you were being dramatic?" Rose's silence was answer enough. Sarah had witnessed years of Margaret's dismissive behavior, had seen the way Rose second-guessed her own perceptions, had watched her best friend shrink smaller and smaller in an effort to avoid her mother's criticism. "That woman nearly killed you," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a steel edge Rose had rarely heard. "You know that, right? How many times did you mention chest pain over the past few months? How many times did you say something felt wrong?" Rose closed her eyes, not wanting to count the occasions when she'd minimized her symptoms or talked herself out of seeking medical attention. "She didn't know," Rose said automatically, falling back into the familiar pattern of defending her mother. "She thought she was helping me not to worry unnecessarily." "Bull," Sarah said bluntly. "She thought she was maintaining control. There's a difference between helping someone manage anxiety and completely dismissing their physical symptoms. You had a heart attack, Rose. A major fucking heart attack at 28 years old. That doesn't happen because someone's being dramatic." The recovery room door opened, and Margaret entered tentatively, looking older and more fragile than Rose had ever seen her. Her perfect makeup was smudged from crying, and her carefully styled hair was disheveled. She stopped short when she saw Sarah, and the two women regarded each other with barely concealed hostility. "Sarah?" Margaret said with stiff politeness. "I didn't know you were here." "Of course I'm here," Sarah replied, not bothering to hide her anger. "My best friend almost died. Where else would I be?" Margaret flinched at the word died, and Rose saw her mother's defensive walls immediately snap into place. "The doctors say she's going to be fine. Young people recover from these things much better than older patients." "These things?" Sarah's voice went dangerously quiet. "You mean massive heart attacks? The kind that kill healthy people every day?" "Sarah, please," Rose interjected, sensing the confrontation building to something explosive. She didn't have the emotional energy for a fight between the two most important women in her life, especially when she was still processing her own near-death experience. But Sarah was just getting started, months of frustration and worry spilling out in the sterile recovery room. "No, Rose. Someone needs to say this. And it's not going to be you because you've been trained your whole life to protect other people's feelings instead of your own safety." Margaret's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me that way? You have no idea what it's like to raise a child who sees disaster around every corner, who turns every minor discomfort into a crisis. Every minor discomfort? Sarah's voice rose. She had chest pain for months. She had elevated blood pressure. She was having cardiac episodes, and you convinced her it was stress. You convinced her she was being dramatic while her heart was literally dying. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Rose watched her mother's face cycle through emotions, denial, anger, and something that looked like dawning horror as the full implications of Sarah's accusations sank in. "I didn't know," Margaret whispered. "How was I supposed to know?" "You could have listened," Sarah said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You could have taken her seriously. You could have said, 'Let's get this checked out just to be safe,' instead of making her feel like a hypochondriac for having legitimate medical symptoms." Dr. Williams chose that moment to enter the recovery room, her presence immediately changing. The dynamic as the three women remembered where they were and why they were there. "How are we feeling, Rose?" Dr. Williams asked, checking the monitors with practiced efficiency. "Better," Rose said. "The chest pain is mostly gone." "Excellent. The procedure went very well, and your cardiac function should return to normal with proper follow-up care." Dr. Williams turned to Margaret and Sarah. "I assume you're both here because you care about Rose, so I'm going to give you some information that might help you help her." Margaret nodded eagerly, seeming grateful for the shift to medical authority and away from Sarah's accusations. "Rose has what we call premature coronary artery disease," Dr. Williams explained. "While heart attacks in people her age are relatively rare, they do happen, and they're often more dangerous because the symptoms are dismissed by both patients and sometimes even medical professionals." Margaret's face went pale. "Are you saying this could happen again?" "With proper medical management, diet, exercise, and stress reduction, Rose's prognosis is very good," Dr. Williams said, "but she'll need close cardiac follow-up, probably for the rest of her life. She'll need to be very attentive to any new cardiac symptoms and seek immediate medical attention if they occur." The doctor's words carried an implicit message that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Rose couldn't afford to have her symptoms dismissed again. Her life might literally depend on having her concerns taken seriously. "What caused it?" Margaret asked, and Rose could hear the desperate need in her voice to find an explanation that didn't implicate her own behavior. "Heart disease is multifactorial," Dr. Williams said diplomatically. "Genetics, lifestyle, stress levels, and sometimes just bad luck." Rose mentioned that her father died of a heart attack. That's certainly a risk factor we'll want to monitor. Rose saw Margaret flinch again at the mention of Jack. Her father's death had been sudden and massive, nothing like Rose's more treatable condition, but the genetic connection was undeniable. "Will she need surgery again?" Sarah asked, her nurses, training focusing on practical concerns. "Unlikely, as long as she maintains good cardiac health and follows up regularly with cardiology. The stent should keep that artery open, and her other vessels looked good on the catheterization." Dr. Williams left them with discharge instructions and follow-up appointments, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Rose was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained from the morning's events. Sarah was still radiating anger, though she was trying to contain it out of respect for Rose's condition. Margaret looked lost, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet and she couldn't find her footing. "I should let you rest," Sarah said finally, leaning down to kiss Rose's forehead. "But I'm not done with this conversation. We need to talk about some changes, okay?" Rose nodded, understanding that Sarah meant changes in how she lived, how she advocated for herself, how she navigated her relationship with her mother. The heart attack had been a wake-up call in more ways than one. After Sarah left, Margaret pulled a chair close to Rose's bedside. For several minutes, they sat in silence, the only sounds the beeping of monitors and the distant noise of hospital activity. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, Mom. But I did cause it, didn't I? Margaret's voice was thick with tears. All those times you tried to tell me something was wrong, and I made you feel like you couldn't trust your own body. Rose wanted to comfort her mother, to fall back into their familiar pattern where Rose minimized her own needs to manage Margaret's emotions. But she was too tired, and the words Dr. Williams had spoken were still echoing in her head. She would need to be very attentive to cardiac symptoms for the rest of her life. Yeah, Mom, Rose said quietly. You did. Margaret began to cry then, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Rose had never seen her mother break down so completely, had never witnessed such raw, undefended emotion from the woman who'd spent Rose's entire life projecting strength and competence. I was so scared of raising a weak child, Margaret wept. My mother always said I was too soft, too indulgent. When you were little and you'd cry over every little hurt, I thought, I was helping you become stronger. I thought I was preparing you for a world that wouldn't coddle you. Rose felt something shift in her chest. Not physical pain this time, but an emotional loosening, like a knot that had been tight for 28 years finally beginning to unravel. But I made you weak in a different way, Margaret continued. I made you weak to your own needs, to your own body. I taught you not to trust yourself. Mom. No, let me say this. I need to say this. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked directly at Rose, something she'd avoided doing since entering the recovery room. I nearly killed my own daughter because I was more afraid of embarrassment than I was concerned about your health. What kind of mother does that? The question hung in the air between them, years of dysfunction and damage laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital room. Rose didn't have an answer, wasn't sure she was strong enough to provide the absolution Margaret seemed to be seeking. The kind of mother who can change, Rose said finally. If she wants to. Margaret nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I want to. God, Rose, I want to so badly. I don't know how, but I want to learn. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Not after 28 years of dismissal and doubt. But it was a beginning. The first crack in a foundation that had nearly collapsed, under the weight of its own contradictions. As Rose drifted toward sleep, the pain medication making her drowsy, she thought about the long road ahead. Recovery from the heart attack would be the easy part. Recovery from a lifetime of learning not to trust herself would be much harder. But for the first time in her adult life, she felt like she might have allies in that fight. People who would listen when she said something was wrong, who would take her seriously when she advocated for her own health and well-being. The monitors continued their steady beeping, each heartbeat a small victory, each rhythm a promise that she would have time to figure out who she wanted to be now that she'd learned to trust her own body again. The Cardiac Rehabilitation Center at St. Mary's Hospital occupied the entire west wing of the second floor, its walls lined with encouraging posters about heart-healthy living and patients' success stories. 3 weeks after her heart attack, Rose sat in a circle with 7 other cardiac patients, ranging in age from 34 to 78, listening to Dr. Rebecca Santos lead their weekly group therapy session. Recovery from a cardiac event isn't just physical, Dr. Santos was explaining to the group. There's often significant emotional and psychological work that needs to happen as well. Many patients experience anxiety, depression, or what we call cardiac neurosis, an intense fear of another event that can actually interfere with healing. Rose had been experiencing all of these symptoms and more. Since coming home from the hospital, she'd become hyper-aware of every sensation in her chest, checking her pulse dozens of times a day, monitoring her heart rate on the fitness tracker Sarah had bought her. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by panic that would wake her in cold sweats, certain another attack was beginning. But more disturbing than the medical anxiety were the revelations that kept surfacing about her relationship with her mother and her own patterns of self-doubt. In the quiet moments between cardiac rehabilitation exercises and doctor's appointments, Rose found herself remembering incidents from her childhood with new clarity, seeing patterns she'd never recognized before. "Rose," Dr. Santos said gently, pulling her back to the present moment. "Would you like to share what you're experiencing? You've been pretty quiet in our sessions so far." Rose looked around the circle at faces that had become familiar over the past 3 weeks. There was Frank, 62, whose wife had insisted he was just having indigestion until he collapsed at their anniversary dinner. Maria, 54, whose female physician had initially diagnosed her chest pain as menopause-related anxiety. David, 34, whose symptoms had been dismissed by 3 different emergency rooms before the 4th finally took him seriously, enough to run cardiac tests. "I keep thinking about how close I came to not calling 911, Rose said finally. "My mom was yelling at me not to be dramatic, and part of me believed her. Part of me thought maybe I was overreacting." "That's more common than you might think," said Elena, a 46-year-old teacher whose husband had convinced her to wait until morning to seek medical attention for her heart attack symptoms. "We're conditioned to doubt ourselves, especially as women. We're taught that our pain isn't as serious as other people's pain." "But it goes deeper than that," Rose continued, the words coming easier now that she'd started. "I realized that I've been dismissing my own needs and instincts my whole life, not just medical stuff, everything. What I wanted to study in college, what kind of job I wanted, whether I wanted to keep living at home. I just deferred to other people's opinions about my own life." Dr. Santos nodded encouragingly. "That's a significant insight, Rose. Can you think of when that pattern might have started?" Rose closed her eyes, remembering. "When I was 6, I had appendicitis. But I'd been complaining about stomach pain for weeks, and my mom kept saying I was trying to avoid school. Even when I was doubled over in pain, she made me go to class. I collapsed during recess and had to have emergency surgery." The group was silent, listening with the attention of people who'd all experienced medical dismissal in their own ways. "After that, whenever I complained about feeling sick or hurt, there was always this question of whether I was being dramatic. Like, maybe I was lying or exaggerating for attention. So I learned to only mention problems when they were really, really bad. And even then, I learned to present them in ways that seemed reasonable and not attention-seeking." Frank shook his head in recognition. "My dad used to say, 'Rub some dirt' on it whenever I got hurt playing sports. Same idea, toughen up, don't complain, don't be weak." But there's a difference between teaching resilience and teaching someone to ignore their body's warning signals, Dr. Santos pointed out. "Rose, what do you think might have happened if you'd felt more confident about trusting your own perceptions?" Uziao thought about the months of chest pain she'd experienced before her heart attack, the times she'd almost called her doctor but talked herself out of it, the warning signs she'd minimized or ignored. "I would have gotten help sooner," she said. "I would have trusted that the pain meant something instead of assuming I was being weak or overdramatic. And that might have prevented the heart attack entirely," Dr. Santos added. "Early intervention can often prevent the kind of massive occlusion you experienced." The weight of this realization settled over Rose like a heavy blanket. Her conditioning to doubt herself, to prioritize other people's comfort over her own well-being, had nearly killed her. The pattern wasn't just annoying or psychologically unhealthy, it was literally life-threatening. After group therapy, Rose drove to Sarah's apartment across town, something she'd been doing more frequently since her release from the hospital. Sarah had been working reduced hours to help with Rose's recovery, and their friendship had deepened as they processed the trauma together. Sarah lived in a converted warehouse loft that was everything Rose's mother's house wasn't: chaotic, colorful, filled with plants and art and evidence of a life lived without constant self-monitoring. Sarah was in the kitchen making tea when Rose arrived, her curly hair pulled back in a messy bun and her face free of makeup. How was group? Sarah asked, handing Rose a steaming mug of chamomile tea. Intense. I keep realizing new things about how fucked up my relationship with my own body has been. Sarah settled beside Rose on the couch, tucking her legs beneath her. Want to talk about it? Rose described the group session, the pattern recognition, the growing awareness of how thoroughly she'd been conditioned to doubt her own perceptions. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled as Rose spoke. There's something I need to tell you, Sarah said when Rose had finished. Something I should have said a long time ago. Rose felt a flutter of anxiety. What? I called your mom 3 months ago. I was worried about you. You kept mentioning chest pain and shortness of breath, and you looked exhausted all the time. I thought maybe if I talked to her, she could help convince you to see a cardiologist. Rose stared at her friend, processing this information. What did she say? She told me I was enabling your hypochondria. She said you'd been doing this since childhood, manufacturing health crises for attention, and that the worst thing anyone could do was take you seriously because it would just reinforce the behavior. The betrayal cut deeper than Rose had expected. While she'd been struggling with symptoms and talking herself out of seeking help, her mother had been actively discouraging the people who cared about her from taking her concerns seriously. She said you'd been to the doctor multiple times over the years for imaginary problems, Sarah continued. She made it sound like you were a chronic malingerer who needed tough love, not medical attention. Rose thought about those doctor visits, the anxiety attacks she'd experienced in high school, the depression after her father's death, the various physical symptoms that had sent her seeking medical care over the years. Margaret had reframed every instance of Rose seeking help as evidence of weakness or attention-seeking. I should have trusted my instincts instead of listening to her, Sarah said, tears in her eyes. I'm a nurse, for God's sake. I know what cardiac symptoms look like, but she was so convincing, so certain that this was just Rose being Rose. It's not your fault, Rose said automatically, though she was still processing the implications of what Sarah had told her. Yes, it is. Partially. Anyway, I let someone else's opinion override my own professional judgment and my concern for my best friend. I should have encouraged you to see a cardiologist regardless of what your mother said. They sat in silence for several minutes, both grappling with the systemic nature of what had happened. It wasn't just Margaret's dismissal that had nearly killed Rose. It was the entire network of people who'd been influenced by Margaret's narrative about Rose's character and medical history. I think I need to move out, Rose said suddenly. Sarah looked up, surprised. Really? I can't keep living in that environment. Every day I stay there, I'm reinforcing the pattern. My mom asks how I'm feeling, and I automatically minimize everything because I don't want to seem dramatic. She comments on my medication schedule or my dietary changes, and I find myself justifying decisions that should be mine alone to make. Where would you go? Rose had been thinking about this question for days. Her job at the marketing firm provided decent insurance but not enough income to afford a place alone, at least not anywhere she'd want to live. But there were alternatives she'd never seriously considered while living under Margaret's influence. There's a position open at the county hospital, Rose said. Patient advocacy coordinator. The pay is better than what I make now, and the work would be meaningful. Help people navigate the medical system, make sure their concerns are heard and addressed appropriately. Sarah's face lit up. Rose, that's perfect. You'd be amazing at that job. I keep thinking about all the people like me, especially women, especially young women, who are having their symptoms dismissed. People who need someone to help them advocate for themselves when they don't have the confidence or knowledge to do it alone. The idea had been germinating since her group therapy sessions, as Rose listened to story after story of medical dismissal and delayed diagnosis. She had first-hand experience with the system's failures, and she had the communication skills to help others navigate those same challenges. When are you going to apply? I already did, Rose admitted. I have an interview next week. Sarah threw her arms around Rose, squeezing her tightly. I'm so proud of you. This is exactly the kind of change you needed to make. Rose felt a flutter of excitement mixed with terror. The thought of leaving her mother's house, of asserting her independence, of building a life based on her own choices rather than her mother's expectations, was both thrilling and terrifying. I haven't told my mom yet, Rose said. How do you think she'll react? Rose thought about Margaret's behavior over the past 3 weeks since the heart attack. Her mother had been solicitous and careful, asking about Rose's symptoms and medical appointments with what seemed like genuine concern. But there had also been subtle attempts to reassert control, questioning Rose's medication schedule, suggesting alternative treatments she'd read about online, expressing doubt about the necessity of some of the lifestyle changes Rose's cardiologist had recommended. She'll try to talk me out of it, Rose said. She'll say I'm not strong enough to live alone, especially after the heart attack. She'll worry about what people will think if her adult daughter moves out right after a medical crisis. She'll make it about her somehow. And how will you respond? Rose considered the question, recognizing it as a test of her newfound commitment to trusting her own judgment. I'll move out anyway, she said finally, because this isn't about what she thinks or what other people think. This is about what I need to do to stay healthy and alive. The words felt powerful in her mouth, like incantations against 28 years of conditioning to prioritize other people's comfort over her own well-being. That evening, Rose drove home to Maple Street with a new sense of purpose. The house looked smaller somehow, less imposing than it had seemed her entire life. She found Margaret in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the same methodical precision she brought to every task. How was your day, sweetheart? Margaret asked, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. Good. I had my group therapy session and I spent some time with Sarah. How are the other patients? Anyone interesting? Rose recognized the fishing expedition, Margaret's way of gathering information to form opinions about Rose's new experiences and influences. They're people who've had heart attacks, Mom. They're dealing with the same recovery issues I am. Well, I hope they're not filling your head with unnecessary worry. Some people in those support groups can be quite dramatic about their conditions. The comment hit Rose like a slap, so perfectly illustrative of the pattern she was trying to break that it almost seemed scripted. Actually, they're helping me understand that I haven't been dramatic enough about my condition, Rose said carefully. Most of them wish they'd advocated more strongly for themselves instead of letting other people minimize their symptoms. Margaret's chopping slowed. I see. Mom, we need to talk about some changes I'm planning to make. Margaret set down her knife and turned to face Rose, her expression already guarded. What kind of changes? I applied for a job at the county hospital. Patient advocacy coordinator. And if I get it, I'm going to move out and get my own place. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Rose watched emotions play across her mother's face, surprise, hurt, anger, and something that might have been fear. You can't be serious, Margaret said finally. Rose, you just had a heart attack 3 weeks ago. This is not the time to be making major life changes. You need stability, family support, familiar surroundings. What I need is to learn to trust my own judgment and make my own decisions about my health and my life, Rose said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. You're not thinking clearly. The trauma of what happened is affecting your judgment. People don't make rational decisions when they're recovering from something this serious. Rose recognized the tactic, undermining her competence to make decisions by attributing her choices to medical trauma or emotional instability. It was a more sophisticated version of the same dismissal she'd experienced her entire life. My judgment is fine, Mom. In fact, it's clearer than it's been in years. But what if you have another episode? What if something happens and you're alone? What if... Then I'll call 911 just like I did 3 weeks ago, Rose interrupted. And this time, I won't let anyone convince me I'm being dramatic. Margaret's face crumpled, and Rose saw through her mother's defensive arguments to the fear underneath. Margaret was terrified of losing control, of Rose becoming independent enough to reject the family dynamic that had defined both their lives. "Is this about what I said during the heart attack?" Margaret asked, her voice small. "Because I've apologized for that. I was scared and confused, and I said things I didn't mean. It's not just about that day, Mom. It's about 28 years of being told not to trust my own perceptions. It's about learning that my survival depends on being able to advocate for myself, even when other people think I'm being unreasonable." Margaret began to cry. The same raw, undefended emotion Rose had witnessed in the hospital recovery room. "I was trying to protect you," Margaret sobbed. "I wanted you to be strong, to be able to handle whatever life threw at you. I thought I was helping you become resilient." "But you weren't building resilience, Mom. You were building compliance. There's a difference." The truth of this statement seemed to hit Margaret like a physical blow. She slumped against the kitchen counter, her face aging years in the space of seconds. "I failed you," she whispered. "I nearly killed you, and I failed you." Rose felt the familiar urge to comfort her mother, to minimize the damage and take responsibility for Margaret's pain. But she recognized the impulse as part of the same pattern she was trying to break. "You can't undo what happened," Rose said, gently. "But you can change how you respond to my needs going forward. You can learn to listen when I say something is wrong. You can support my decisions instead of automatically assuming I'm not competent to make them." Margaret looked up, tears streaming down her face. "How? How do I do that?" "Start by accepting that I'm moving out. Support my job interview instead of trying to talk me out of it. Ask me how you can help instead of telling me what I should do." The rice. Conversation continued for another hour, cycling through Margaret's fears and objections, and Rose's increasingly confident responses. By the end, they hadn't resolved everything, but they'd established new ground rules for their relationship. Boundaries that would protect Rose's autonomy while leaving room for a healthier connection between them. As Rose went to bed that night, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before her father's death: genuine hope for the future. Not just hope that she would recover from her heart attack, but hope that she could build a life based on her own choices, her own values, her own assessment of what was best for her health and happiness. The monitors by her bedside continued, their steady rhythm, each heartbeat a reminder that she had survived, that she had fought for her own life when it mattered most, and that she was strong enough to keep fighting for the life she wanted to build going forward. 6 months after her heart attack, Rose stood in the lobby of County General Hospital, adjusting her new employee ID badge and smoothing her navy blazer. The patient advocacy coordinator position had been hers after a single interview, where her personal experience with medical dismissal had resonated powerfully with the hiring committee. Today was her first official day, and she felt a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that reminded her she was truly alive. The cardiac rehabilitation program at St. Mary's had ended 2 months ago, but Rose still carried the lessons from those group sessions with her. She'd learned that recovery wasn't just about healing her heart. It was about rebuilding her entire relationship with her own body, her own needs, and her own voice. Her apartment was small, but perfect, a 1-bedroom unit in a converted Victorian house just 10 minutes from the hospital. Margaret had helped her move, though not without expressing concerns about Rose living alone so soon after her episode. Margaret still couldn't bring herself to say heart attack consistently. But Rose had held firm in her decision, and gradually, Margaret had begun to accept that her daughter was building a life based on her own choices rather than her mother's fears. The relationship between them was different now, more honest, more bounded, more respectful of Rose's autonomy. Margaret still occasionally slipped into old patterns of dismissal or control, but Rose had learned to recognize these moments and respond with calm firmness rather than automatic compliance. It was a work in progress, but it was progress. Rose's Supervisor Janet Martinez, Sarah's older sister as it turned out, met her at the elevator with a warm smile and a stack of case files. "Ready to change some lives?" Janet asked, leading Rose toward her new office. "I think I'm ready to help people change their own lives," Rose corrected gently, already thinking like an advocate rather than a rescuer. Her first case was Maria Gonzalez, a 34-year-old mother of 3 whose chest pain had been attributed to anxiety by 2 different emergency room physicians. Maria sat across from Rose's desk, her hands twisted in her lap, describing symptoms that sounded hauntingly familiar. "They keep telling me it's stress," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know my body. This isn't stress. This is something else." Rose felt a chill of recognition. Maria's story was her story, with variations: the dismissal, the self-doubt, the gradual erosion of confidence in her own perceptions. But this time, Rose was positioned to intervene before it was too late. "Tell me about your family history," Rose said, pulling out a comprehensive intake form she'd developed based on her own experience navigating the medical system. Over the next hour, Rose learned that Maria's father had died of a heart attack. At 42, that Maria had been experiencing increasing chest pain and shortness of breath for 3 months, and that she'd been convinced by well-meaning family members and medical professionals that she was too young and too healthy to have cardiac problems. "Maria, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Rose said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Your symptoms and family history warrant cardiac evaluation, regardless of your age or what anyone else has told you. I'm going to help you get that evaluation, and I'm going to make sure the medical team takes your concerns seriously." Maria's eyes filled with tears, relief, gratitude, and something else Rose recognized as validation. Someone was finally listening. Someone was finally taking her seriously. Rose spent the rest of the morning making calls, reviewing Maria's previous emergency room records, and scheduling an appointment with Dr. Chen, the same interventional cardiologist, who'd saved Rose's life. She used her own medical experience and her new professional authority to cut through the bureaucratic obstacles that might have delayed Maria's care. By noon, Maria had an appointment for a stress test the following week, and a promise from Dr. Chen's office that her case would be expedited if any concerning symptoms developed. More importantly, she had a written plan for seeking immediate medical attention that specifically instructed emergency room staff to take her cardiac symptoms seriously, regardless of her age or gender. "How do you know so much about this?" Maria asked as they reviewed the plan together. Rose touched the small scar on her chest where the catheterization had been performed. "Because I've been exactly where you are, and I almost waited too long to trust what my body was telling me." Rose's second case that day was James Patterson, a 60-year-old construction worker whose wife had called the patient advocacy line in frustration. James had been experiencing what he described as heartburn for weeks, but his primary care physician had prescribed antacids and suggested diet changes without ordering any cardiac tests. "He won't listen to me," Mrs. Patterson said during their phone conversation. "He keeps saying it's just indigestion, but it's not getting better with the medication. He's stubborn, and the doctor isn't taking it seriously either." Rose scheduled a meeting with both James and his wife for later that week, but she also called James's primary care physician directly. Using her professional credentials and her growing reputation within the hospital system, she was able to discuss James's case and suggest that cardiac evaluation might be warranted given his age, gender, and symptom profile. The afternoon brought a different kind of case: 16-year-old Ashley Chen, whose parents were convinced her fatigue and shortness of breath were signs of depression or school avoidance. Ashley's story reminded Rose painfully of her own teenage years, when her anxiety symptoms had been dismissed as attention-seeking behavior. "Nobody believes me," Ashley said, slumped in the chair across from Rose's desk. "My parents think I'm faking to get out of school." The counselor thinks I need antidepressants, but I'm not sad. I'm tired, like exhausted all the time, and sometimes I can't catch my breath. Rose spent an hour with Ashley, using gentle questions to explore her symptoms and family history. What emerged was a picture of possible cardiac arrhythmia, irregular heartbeats that could cause the fatigue and breathing difficulties Ashley was describing. "Ashley, I believe you," Rose said, and watched the teenager's face transform with relief. "And we're going to figure out what's causing these symptoms. Sometimes young people have heart rhythm problems that aren't dangerous, but do need treatment." By the end of her first day, Rose had opened 6 cases, made dozens of phone calls, and potentially saved multiple lives by ensuring that symptoms were properly evaluated rather than dismissed. She felt exhausted, but fulfilled in a way her previous job had never provided. Sarah was waiting in Rose's apartment when she got home, having used the spare key Rose had given her to let herself in and start dinner. "So," Sarah said, looking up from the stir-fry she was preparing, "how was your first day saving the world?" "I think the world might be saving me," Rose replied, settling onto her couch with a feeling of deep satisfaction. "Every person I helped today was someone who needed what I needed 6 months ago. Someone to listen, someone to believe them, someone to help them navigate a medical system that doesn't always take patients seriously." They ate dinner together, Rose describing her cases while Sarah offered the professional perspective of someone who'd worked in healthcare for years. The conversation eventually drifted to Rose's recovery, her relationship with Margaret, and the ways her near-death experience had fundamentally changed her approach to living. "Do you ever regret not calling 911 sooner?" Sarah asked. "Like, do you wonder what would have happened if you'd sought help the first time you felt chest pain?" Rose considered the question. "Sometimes, but I also think everything happened the way it needed to happen. If I'd gotten help earlier, I might have had a smaller cardiac event, gotten treatment, and never really examined the patterns in my life that made me ignore my symptoms for so long." "So you think the heart attack was necessary?" "I think the heart attack was a wake-up call that probably saved my life in more ways than one. Not just medically, but psychologically, emotionally. It forced me to confront everything I'd been avoiding about my relationship with my mother, my own self-advocacy, my patterns of minimizing my own needs." They were interrupted by Rose's phone ringing. Margaret's name appeared on the screen, and Rose felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that still accompanied her mother's calls, though it was much less intense than it had been 6 months ago. "Hi, Mom," Rose answered. "How was your first day, sweetheart?" Margaret's voice carried genuine warmth and what sounded like authentic interest rather than the probing concern that had characterized their conversations for most of Rose's adult life. "It was good, really good. I helped 6 people today, people who were having their symptoms dismissed or minimized. It felt meaningful in a way I've never experienced at work before." "I'm proud of you," Margaret said, and Rose could hear that. She meant it. "Your father would be proud too. He always said you had a gift for understanding people." The mention of Jack still brought tears to Rose's eyes, but they were softer now, tinged with gratitude rather than just grief. "Mom, I want to ask you something," Rose said, making a decision that had been building for weeks. "Would you be interested in coming to one of my group therapy sessions? Dr. Santos said family members are welcome, and I think it might help you understand what I've been working through." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Rose wondered if the call had dropped. "You want me to come to therapy with you?" Margaret asked finally. "Not as a patient, as support, so you can hear from other people who've experienced medical dismissal, who've had to learn to advocate for themselves. I think it might help you understand why the changes I'm making are so important." Another long pause, then, "When is the next session?" "Thursday evening, 7 o'clock. I'll be there." After they hung up, Rose sat quietly for several minutes, processing the significance of what had just happened. 6 months ago, the idea of Margaret voluntarily attending a therapy session would have been unthinkable. The heart attack hadn't just changed Rose. It had forced Margaret to confront her own patterns and their consequences. Sarah had been listening to the conversation with interest. "That's huge," she said. "Your mom agreeing to come to group therapy." "She's trying," Rose said. "It's not perfect, and she still slips into old patterns sometimes. But she's trying to understand and change, which is more than I ever expected." That evening, as Rose prepared for bed in her own apartment, she went through her nighttime routine, checking her blood pressure, taking her cardiac medications, reviewing her day for any symptoms that might warrant medical attention. But these tasks felt different now than they had in the weeks immediately following her heart attack. They felt like self-care rather than hypervigilance, like appropriate attention to her health rather than cardiac neurosis. She thought about Maria Gonzalez, probably lying in bed right now wondering if she would finally get the cardiac evaluation she needed. She thought about James Patterson, whose wife was fighting to get his symptoms taken seriously. She thought about Ashley Chen, whose fatigue and breathing problems might finally be properly diagnosed and treated. Each of these cases represented something larger than individual medical care. They represented the systemic changes that needed to happen in how medical professionals, families, and patients themselves approach symptoms that didn't fit neat diagnostic categories. Rose's job was just one small part of that larger shift, but it felt significant in a way that her previous marketing work never had. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Chen's office. "Maria Gonzalez's stress test has been moved up to tomorrow at 2 p.m. due to schedule opening. Please confirm with patient." Rose smiled as she forwarded the message to Maria. Sometimes the system worked the way it was supposed to work, especially when people like Rose were there to help navigate it and advocate for those who needed support. As she drifted toward sleep, Rose's last conscious thought was about the butterfly effect of her near-death experience. Her heart attack had almost killed her, but it had also saved her life in ways that went far beyond cardiac intervention. It had taught her to trust her own perceptions, to advocate for her own needs, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than compliance and control. And now, through her work, that same lesson was rippling outward to touch other lives, other families, other people who needed permission to trust what their bodies were telling them. The monitors by her bedside showed steady, healthy rhythms. Each heartbeat, a small celebration, each breath a reminder that she had chosen life when it mattered most, and that she continued to choose life every day through the decisions she made about how to live, how to work, and how to love. 3 months later, Rose received a call that would validate everything she'd hoped her new career could accomplish. Maria Gonzalez had been diagnosed with a 90% blockage in her left anterior descending artery, the same widowmaker lesion Rose had experienced. The stress test Rose had helped expedite had caught the problem just in time, and Maria had received a stent that prevented what would almost certainly have been a massive, potentially fatal heart attack. "I wanted to call you myself," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "The cardiologist said I probably had days, maybe weeks before this would have killed me. You saved my life by helping me get taken seriously." Rose hung up the phone and sat quietly in her office, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Her own near-death experience, her months of recovery and self-discovery, her decision to change careers and learn to advocate for others. All of it had led to this moment when another woman's life had been saved because someone finally listened to what she was saying about her own body. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. Every day brought new cases, new opportunities to help people navigate the complex intersection of medical care and self-advocacy. Rose had found her calling in the place she'd least expected, in the aftermath of her own medical crisis, in the hard-won wisdom that came from almost losing everything. She was no longer the woman who'd lived her entire adult life in her childhood bedroom, deferring to other people's opinions about her own needs and perceptions. She was no longer the daughter who prioritized her mother's comfort over her own survival. She was no longer the patient who apologized for taking up medical professionals' time with her dramatic symptoms. She was Rose Chen, patient advocate, heart attack survivor, and someone who had learned the life-saving power of trusting her own voice. And every day, she used that voice to help other people find theirs. The work was just beginning, but Rose finally understood what her father had meant when he'd said she had a gift for understanding people. She hadn't just survived her heart attack. She had transformed it into a calling that would save other lives. One conversation, one case, one act of advocacy at a time. Her heart beat steady and strong, and with each beat, she was making the world a little safer for people who needed someone to believe them when they said something was wrong. It was the best possible outcome of the worst day of her life, and Rose couldn't imagine doing anything else with the second chance she'd been given. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.